Welcome to Rural Farm Tales. If you enjoy rural stories, like and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Now, my dear friend Peterson will help us come to today's story.
On a Tuesday morning in March of 1973, a farmer named Walter Briggs walked into the Stafford County Feed and Supply in St. John, Kansas, and asked Ernie Dawson behind the counter for something that made Ernie think he'd misheard. "Wildflower seeds," Walter said. "You got any?" Ernie blinked. He'd been running this feed store for 18 years. He'd sold every kind of crop seed imaginable: wheat, corn, milo, soybeans, alfalfa. He'd sold fertilizer by the ton and pesticide by the barrel. But in 18 years, not one single farmer had ever walked in and asked for wildflower seeds. "Wildflowers," Ernie repeated slowly, like he was tasting a foreign word. "Like decorative flowers? For your wife's garden?" "For my fields," Walter said. "I need black-eyed Susans, coneflowers, wild bergamot, yarrow, whatever you can get. I'm going to plant 'em between my wheat rows." The store went quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of fertilizer and seed corn hung in the air, like it always did. But something had shifted. The comfortable rhythm of a Tuesday morning at the feed store had been interrupted by something nobody knew how to process. Now let me tell you about the moment that followed, because it set the tone for the next 3 years of Walter Briggs' life. There were 4 other farmers in the store that morning. Dale Hutchins, who farmed 800 acres north of town and drove a brand-new Ford pickup that he'd paid cash for. Pete Svoboda, who'd just bought a $3,000 spray rig for his operation and was eager to show it off. Carl Wentz, president of the County Farm Bureau, who considered himself the voice of modern agriculture in Stafford County. And young Tommy Aldrich, just 23, who'd taken over his father's place 6 months ago after the old man's heart gave out in the middle of harvest. They'd all come in for the same thing: pesticide. The aphids had been bad last year, worse than anyone could remember. The county extension agent, a young man named Howard Price, fresh out of Kansas State, was predicting an even worse year ahead. Every serious farmer in Stafford County was stocking up on malathion, Sevin, parathion, whatever it took to keep the bugs from eating their profits. The counter was covered with pesticide cans, metal containers with skull and crossbones warnings, paper bags of powder that could kill every living thing in a field if you mixed it strong enough. This was modern farming in 1973, chemistry against nature, and chemistry was winning. And here was Walter Briggs asking for flowers. Dale Hutchins was the first one to laugh. Not a mean laugh exactly, more like the laugh you'd give if someone told you they were going to drive to town in a wheelbarrow, a laugh of pure disbelief. "Flowers," Dale said, "between your wheat rows. Walt, you feeling okay? You hit your head on something?" "I'm fine," Walter said. His voice was calm, level. He didn't seem embarrassed or defensive. "Just trying something different." "Different," Pete Svoboda said, shaking his head. He had a case of malathion on the counter, ready to load into his truck. The cans gleamed under the fluorescent lights like ammunition. "Walt, I just spent $400 on spray equipment. The extension office says we're looking at the worst aphid season in a decade, and you want to plant posies?" Carl Wentz stepped forward. He was a big man, well-fed, with the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted himself in his life. "Walter, I've known you 20 years. You're not a stupid man. So I'm going to ask you straight, what's this really about? You having money troubles? Because if you can't afford pesticide this year, the co-op has a credit program." "I can afford pesticide," Walter said. "I just don't want it." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Don't want pesticide. In 1973, that was like saying you didn't want oxygen. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had an idea that made perfect sense to you but sounded crazy to everyone around you? An idea so different from what everyone else was doing that people didn't just disagree, they laughed? What did you do? Did you explain yourself? Did you try to convince them? Or did you just do what Walter Briggs did? Buy your seeds and walk out the door? Ernie Dawson scratched his head. Walt, I don't stock wildflower seeds. This is a feed store, not a garden center. But I suppose I could order some from a supplier in Wichita. Take about a week. That'd be fine, Walter said. How much? For a mix like you're describing? Maybe $12? $15? Walter pulled out his wallet and laid a 20 on the counter. Keep the change for your trouble. I'll pick 'em up next Tuesday. He turned to leave. Behind him, he could hear the whispers starting, the kind of whispers that would follow him for years. Bug farmer, Carl Wentz said, loud enough for Walter to hear. Walt Briggs, the bug farmer, growing a buffet for the aphids. Walter didn't turn around. He just walked out into the Kansas sunshine, got in his truck, and drove home. The name stuck. Within a week, everyone in St. John knew about Walter Briggs and his wildflower experiment. Within a month, it had become a running joke at the coffee shop, at the co-op, at the Lutheran church after Sunday services, at the grain elevator during harvest talk. Hey, Walt, how's your flower garden? Seen any butterflies out there, Walt? My wife wants to know if she can come pick a bouquet for the kitchen table. You should enter the county fair, Walt. Bet you'd win a ribbon for prettiest wheat field. Walter didn't respond to the jokes. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to explain. He just planted his flowers and waited for time to prove him right. Let me tell you about Walter Briggs, because you need to understand why a man would invite 3 years of mockery for a $12.50 bag of seeds. Walter was 46 years old in 1973, and he'd been farming his family's 480 acres since he came back from Korea in 1954. He wasn't a radical. He wasn't a hippie or an environmentalist or any of the things people were calling themselves in those days. He didn't subscribe to Mother Earth news or attend protest rallies or lecture people about chemicals. He was just a farmer who paid attention to things other farmers didn't notice. And what Walter had been paying attention to for the past several years was bugs. Not the bad bugs. Everybody paid attention to those. The aphids that sucked the life out of wheat. The corn borers that tunneled through stalks until they collapsed. The cutworms that killed seedlings before they had a chance to grow. Every farmer in Kansas knew those bugs intimately because those bugs were the enemy. But Walter had started noticing the other bugs, the ones nobody talked about. It had started in the summer of 1969, during a particularly bad aphid year. Walter had been walking his fields early one morning before the heat set in, assessing the damage. The aphids were everywhere, tiny green bodies clustered on every stalk, sucking the sap, weakening the plants. His heart had sunk. This was going to be a bad year. But then he'd noticed something else. In one corner of the field, an area near the fence line where some wildflowers had taken root because Walter hadn't gotten around to spraying there, the aphid population was different. Not gone, but controlled. And crawling among the wheat stalks, he'd seen ladybugs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, tiny red shells with black spots moving from plant to plant like they were on patrol. Walter had knelt down in the dirt and watched. A ladybug landed on an aphid-covered stalk. It moved slowly, deliberately, and then, snap. It ate an aphid, then another, then another. In the space of a minute, that single ladybug had consumed a dozen aphids. Walter had looked around. The corner of the field near the wildflowers was full of ladybugs. The middle of the field, where he'd sprayed 2 weeks earlier, had almost none. That night, Walter had driven to the county library in St. John and asked the librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Halverson, if they had any books on insects. "What kind of insects?" Mrs. Halverson had asked. "All of them," Walter said, "especially the ones that eat other insects." And so began Walter Briggs's education. The county library wasn't much, but they could order books from the state system in Topeka. Over the next 3 years, Walter read everything he could find on entomology, the study of insects. He read about predator-prey relationships, the delicate balance that nature had maintained for millions of years. He read about something called biological control, using one species to control another. He read about experiments in California where farmers were releasing ladybugs by the millions to control aphids instead of spraying chemicals. He read about lacewings, whose delicate green larvae were called aphid lions because of their voracious appetite. He read about parasitic wasps, tiny creatures that laid their eggs inside caterpillars and hornworms, killing them from the inside out. He read about ground beetles that hunted cutworms at night, and hoverflies whose larvae could eat 400 aphids before they matured into adults. And he read about the problem with pesticides, a problem that most farmers in 1973 hadn't even heard about yet, a problem that would take another 20 years to become common knowledge. Let me tell you about that problem, because it's the key to understanding what happened in Stafford County over the next 3 years. When you spray a field with pesticide, you kill bugs. That's the point. The aphids die, the borers die, the cutworms die. Your crop is saved, at least for now. But here's what most farmers didn't understand in 1973. You don't kill all the bugs equally. The pest insects, the aphids, the borers, the cutworms, they breed fast. Incredibly fast. A single aphid can produce a new generation in a week. That means if even a few aphids survive the spray, and a few always do because no chemical is 100% effective, those survivors can repopulate the entire field within a month. 1 aphid becomes 10. 10 become 100. 100 become 10,000. But the predator insects, the ladybugs, the lacewings, the parasitic wasps, they breed slow. They have longer life cycles, smaller populations, more complex reproductive needs. When you spray a field, you might kill 95% of the aphids. Sounds good, right? But you also kill 99% of the ladybugs. The aphids bounce back in a month. The ladybugs take a year or more to recover, if they recover at all. And here's the worst part. Every time you spray, you're selecting for resistance. The aphids that survive are the ones that can tolerate the poison. They pass that tolerance to their offspring. Spray enough times, and you end up with aphids that laugh at malathion, aphids that shrug off parathion, aphids that treat your pesticide like seasoning. Meanwhile, you've killed all their predators. It's a trap. The more you spray, the more you need to spray. The chemicals that saved your crop this year become useless next year. You need stronger chemicals, more frequent applications, higher doses. And all the while, you're destroying the natural systems that kept pest populations in check for millions of years before humans invented pesticides. Scientists had a name for this trap. They called it the pesticide treadmill. Once you got on, it was almost impossible to get off. You had to keep running faster and faster just to stay in place. Walter Briggs understood this in 1973. Most farmers wouldn't understand it for another 20 years, and some never would. Now let me tell you about Walter's flower strips, because they weren't just pretty, they were strategic. The wildflowers Walter planted weren't random choices. He'd selected them specifically based on what he'd read about beneficial insects and their life cycles. Black-eyed Susans and coneflowers bloomed in early summer, right when the first generation of pests appeared. They provided nectar and pollen for adult lacewings and parasitic wasps, food the adults needed to survive and reproduce. Without that food source, the beneficial insects would leave the area, searching for better habitat elsewhere. Wild bergamot, with its purple clusters of flowers, attracted hoverflies from miles around. Adult hoverflies fed on the nectar, but their larvae were voracious aphid predators. One hoverfly larva could eat 400 aphids before it matured, and a healthy stand of wild bergamot could support thousands of hoverflies. Yarrow, with its flat white flower clusters, provided shelter for ground beetles, nocturnal hunters that patrolled the soil surface looking for cutworms and other soil-dwelling pests. During the day, the beetles hid under the yarrow's feathery foliage. At night, they went to work, and all of them together created what ecologists would later call habitat strips, corridors of biodiversity running through the monoculture of wheat, giving beneficial insects a place to live, breed, shelter, and spread into the crop. Walter planted these strips along every fence line, around every field edge, and in bands through the middle of his largest fields. It wasn't random. He'd calculated the distances based on how far different beneficial insects could travel from their habitat to hunt in the crop. Most could travel about 200 feet effectively, so Walter made sure no part of his wheat field was more than 200 feet from a flower strip. From the road, it looked chaotic, ribbons of color interrupting the orderly rows of wheat. To the other farmers, it looked like laziness, or insanity, or both. "Walt's letting his fields go wild," they said at the coffee shop. "Must be giving up on farming," they said at the grain elevator. "That land's going to be nothing but weeds in 5 years," they said at the co-op. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, because they never got close enough to look, was that Walter's fields had more ladybugs per square foot than any other farm in the county. More lacewings, more parasitic wasps, more ground beetles, more of the tiny, invisible army that had been controlling pests since long before humans started farming. The first year, 1973, was a wash. Walter's flowers were just getting established. Most wouldn't even bloom until midsummer, too late to build significant populations of beneficials. His pest pressure was about the same as everyone else's. Bad, but manageable. The other farmers sprayed twice that season, once in early June and once in late July. Walter sprayed once in early June, before his beneficial populations had time to build up. He figured he needed to buy himself some time while the system got established. "See?" Carl Wentz said at the Farm Bureau meeting that fall. "Even the bug farmer has to spray. What's the point of all those flowers if you're just going to poison them anyway?" Walter didn't argue. He just took notes on his ladybug populations and waited for next year. The second year, 1974, things started to change. The aphids came back worse than ever, just like the extension agent had predicted. The spring had been wet, the early summer warm, perfect conditions for pest populations to explode. Farmers who'd sprayed twice in 73 were spraying 3 times in 74. Some were spraying 4 times, mixing chemicals in combinations the labels warned against, desperate to stay ahead of the bugs. The chemical bills were getting out of control. Dale Hutchins spent $2,400 on pesticides that year, more than he'd spent on seed. Pete Svoboda's new spray rig ran constantly, burning diesel and spraying poison from dawn to dusk. But Walter only sprayed once. His flower strips were mature now, blooming from May through September in a continuous sequence of color and nectar. His beneficial insect populations had exploded over the winter, emerging in spring to find exactly the habitat they needed to thrive. Every morning Walter would walk through his fields before the heat set in, and every morning he'd see ladybugs everywhere, on every stalk, every leaf, eating aphids faster than the aphids could reproduce. He'd see lacewing larvae, ugly little creatures that looked like tiny alligators, prowling the plants and devouring everything in their path. He'd find aphid mummies, the dried-out husks of aphids that had been parasitized by tiny wasps, their bodies now just incubators for the next generation of predators. His neighbors thought he was crazy. They drove past his fields and shook their heads at the flowers. They thought he was losing his crop to stubbornness and fantasy. But when harvest came, Walter's yields were only 5% below the county average, and his chemical costs were 80% lower than anyone else's. He'd spent $300 on pest control. Dale Hutchins had spent $2,400. When you did the math, Walter had come out ahead. "Lucky," they said at the grain elevator. "He got lucky. Wait till next year." Let me tell you about year 3. Because that's when the bill came due for Stafford County. The summer of 1975 started hot in early May and stayed hot through September. perfect conditions for aphids. The populations exploded in June, earlier and larger than anyone expected. By mid-June, the county extension agent was calling it the worst infestation in 30 years. The farmers sprayed, then they sprayed again. Then they sprayed a third time, using stronger concentrations than the labels recommended, mixing chemicals in desperate combinations. And the aphids kept coming. Something had changed. The chemicals that had worked for years weren't working anymore. Malathion, which had been the gold standard for aphid control since the 1950s, seemed to bounce right off them. Parathion, the stronger alternative, barely made a dent. The farmers sprayed and sprayed, and the aphids kept multiplying. The county extension agent, Howard Price, drove from farm to farm with a grim expression. He'd been taught at Kansas State that pesticides were the solution to every pest problem. Now he was watching that solution fail in real time, and he didn't know what to tell people. "It's resistance," he finally admitted at an emergency meeting at the Farm Bureau. "The aphids have developed resistance to the chemicals, multiple chemicals. I've never seen anything like it." "So what do we spray?" Dale Hutchins demanded. "There's got to be something." Howard shook his head. "I've called the university. I've called the chemical companies. They're working on new formulations, but nothing's available yet. Maybe next year." "Next year?" Pete Svoboda's voice cracked. "My wheat will be dead by next week. What am I supposed to do until next year?" Nobody had an answer. By mid-July, half the wheat in Stafford County was showing severe aphid damage, stunted growth, yellowing leaves, empty heads where grain should have been forming. By August, entire fields were lost. Thousands of acres of wheat that would never make it to harvest, standing in the fields like monuments to failure. The farmers sprayed more. They tried everything the extension office suggested and everything the chemical salesman promised. Nothing worked, except on Walter Briggs's farm. Now let me tell you about the day the neighbors came to look, because it's the moment when everything changed. It was a Saturday in early August. The temperature had hit 102 by noon. The hot wind coming off the plains felt like opening an oven door. Dale Hutchins drove his truck down the gravel road that separated his land from Walter's. He hadn't spoken to Walter in months, hadn't wanted to admit that he was even curious about those flower strips. But desperation has a way of overcoming pride. He stopped at the fence line and got out. On his side of the fence, his wheat was dying. The stalks were brown and stunted, barely knee-high when they should have been waist-high. The aphids had sucked the life out of every plant, even from 10 feet away. Dale could see them, millions of tiny green bodies covering every stalk, every leaf, every head of grain, a green tide of destruction. His spray rig was parked at the edge of the field, useless now. He'd used his entire season's supply of chemicals in 6 weeks, and it hadn't made a damn bit of difference. On Walter's side of the fence, the wheat was golden. Not just healthy, thriving. The stalks stood tall and straight, heavy heads bowed with grain. The leaves were green where they should be green and golden where they should be golden. And running through the field, like ribbons on a present, Dale could see the flower strips, bands of yellow black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, white yarrow, and the delicate purple of wild bergamot. Dale stood at that fence for a long time. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he climbed through, something farmers didn't normally do without permission, and walked into Walter's field. He knelt down and looked at a wheat stalk up close. There were aphids on it, a few here and there, small clusters on the lower leaves. But something was different. Something was keeping them in check. Then he saw the ladybug. It was crawling up the stalk toward the aphid cluster, moving with purpose. Dale watched as it reached the aphids and began to eat, methodically, efficiently, one after another. In the space of a minute, that single ladybug consumed a dozen aphids. Dale looked around. The field was full of ladybugs. Everywhere he looked, red shells with black spots, crawling over the wheat like a tiny army on patrol. And when he looked closer, he saw more. Tiny orange larvae crawling on the leaves. Lacewing larvae, he'd later learn, eating aphids even faster than the ladybugs. Green lacewing adults hovering over the flower strips, their transparent wings catching the sunlight. Tiny wasps, no bigger than gnats, moving from plant to plant doing something he couldn't quite see. He saw an ecosystem, a whole functioning ecosystem, operating right there in the middle of a wheat field. Nature doing what nature had done for millions of years before humans invented pesticides. "They're eating them," Dale said out loud, though no one was there to hear. "My God, the bugs are eating the bugs." He walked through Walter's field for an hour, seeing things he'd never noticed in 30 years of farming. The wildflowers weren't weeds, they were habitat. The insects weren't pests, they were workers. The whole system was interconnected in ways he'd never imagined. That evening at 6 o'clock, Dale Hutchins knocked on Walter Briggs's door. Walter answered in his work clothes, dirt still on his boots. He looked tired. Harvest was coming, and even a healthy crop meant long days ahead. "Dale," Walter said, no surprise in his voice, like he'd been expecting this visit for 3 years. "I walked your field today," Dale said, "without asking. I apologize for that." "No need. I saw the ladybugs, the lacewings, all those predators." Dale struggled with the word. It wasn't part of his vocabulary, at least not when talking about insects. Walter nodded, waited. "I need you to tell me what you did," Dale said. "I need you to tell me everything. Let me tell you about that conversation because it lasted 6 hours and changed the way farming was done in Stafford County." They sat on Walter's porch as the sun went down, drinking iced tea that Walter's wife, Helen, kept refilling. Walter talked and Dale listened, asking questions when he didn't understand, taking notes on a legal pad he'd brought from his truck. Walter didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't mention the laughter at the feed store, or the jokes at the coffee shop, or the 3 years he'd spent being called the bug farmer behind his back. He just explained what he'd learned, about predator-prey relationships, about habitat strips, about the pesticide treadmill that farmers had unknowingly stepped onto years ago. He showed Dale his books, dog-eared and underlined. He showed him the articles he'd collected from agricultural journals, photocopied at the county library. He drew diagrams of insect life cycles on notebook paper, the fast reproduction of pests, the slower reproduction of predators, the math that made pesticides work in the short term and fail in the long term. He explained why spraying early was sometimes necessary, but spraying late was almost always counterproductive. He explained how each flower species attracted different beneficial insects, and why you needed a sequence of blooms from spring through fall to keep the predator populations fed. And he told Dale the most important thing he'd learned. "The bugs aren't the enemy," Walter said. "Some bugs are the enemy, but most bugs are just bugs, and some of them, the ones we've been killing along with the pests, are the best weapon we've got. Better than any chemical, because chemicals stop working eventually. But ladybugs never stop being hungry." Dale Hutchins went home that night with a head full of ideas and a heart full of something he hadn't felt in months, hope. The next week, Dale called a meeting at the Farm Bureau. Every farmer in the county was invited. Most of them came. They were desperate, and desperation makes people listen to things they wouldn't normally hear. The meeting room at the Farm Bureau was standing room only. 43 farmers plus wives and sons and county officials packed into a space meant for 20. The air was thick with tension and the smell of men who'd been fighting a losing battle all summer. Walter stood up in front of the crowd, in front of the same men who had spent 3 years laughing at him, and he told them what he knew. He didn't lecture, he didn't preach, he didn't say, "I told you so," or remind them of the jokes they'd made at his expense. He just explained, in simple terms, what he'd done and why it worked. He passed around photos of his fields showing the flower strips. He passed around jars containing live ladybugs, live lacewings, samples of parasitized aphids. He showed them the future of farming, and he asked nothing in return. And then he said something that nobody expected. "I was lucky," Walter said. "I had 3 years to build up my beneficial populations before this resistance problem hit. You all don't have that time, but I can help you get started." A hand went up in the back. Carl Wentz, the same Carl Wentz who had coined the term bug farmer 3 years earlier. "Walt," Carl said, his voice humbler than anyone had ever heard it, "why would you help us? After the way we treated you?" Walter was quiet for a moment. The room held its breath. "Because you're my neighbors," Walter said finally. "That's what neighbors do." Over the next month, Walter Briggs drove to every farm in Stafford County. He walked their fields in the early morning and the late evening, when the heat wasn't so brutal. He identified their pest problems and their potential beneficial populations. He helped them find sources for wildflower seeds. He told them which flowers to plant and where to plant them. He did it for free. He never asked for a dollar. He never reminded anyone of the 3 years of mockery. He just helped because that's who Walter Briggs was. The recovery wasn't instant. It took 2 years for most farms to rebuild their beneficial insect populations. Some farmers couldn't wait that long. They sold out, moved away, gave up on farming altogether. The 1975 aphid plague had broken something in them that flowers couldn't fix. But the farmers who stayed, who listened to Walter, who planted their own flower strips and learned to tolerate some pest damage in exchange for long-term stability, those farmers came out the other side with something better than they'd had before. They had fields that could take care of themselves. Let me tell you about what happened to Walter Briggs, because it's not the ending you might expect. In 1978, a professor from Kansas State University named Dr. Helen Carmichael read an article about Stafford County's flower farmers in a regional agricultural magazine. The article mentioned a man named Walter Briggs who had pioneered the technique. She drove down from Manhattan, a 3-hour trip, to meet him. She spent a week on Walter's farm, counting insects, measuring populations, documenting everything he'd learned through trial and error over 5 years. She took soil samples, she photographed the flower strips, she interviewed Walter for hours, filling notebook after notebook with his observations. On the last day, they sat on his porch again, just like he'd sat with Dale Hutchins 3 years earlier. "Do you know what you've done here?" Dr. Carmichael asked him. "Grown some wheat," Walter said. "Planted some flowers." Dr. Carmichael shook her head. "You've pioneered integrated pest management. There are researchers who've spent their entire careers trying to prove what you figured out on your own with library books and observation. You're 10 years ahead of the science." Walter wasn't interested in being ahead of the science. He was interested in growing wheat and keeping his farm solvent, and maybe, if there was time, sitting on his porch in the evening and watching the fireflies come out over his fields. But he did agree to one thing. He let Dr. Carmichael bring her students to his farm. Over the next decade, Kansas State University sent hundreds of agricultural students to Stafford County to learn from the bug farmer. They studied his flower strips. They counted his ladybugs. They measured his yields and his costs and his soil health. They wrote papers and theses and dissertations. And slowly, year by year, the ideas that Walter Briggs had figured out by reading library books and paying attention spread across Kansas, across the Midwest, across the country, and eventually across the world. Today, they call it integrated pest management. They call it conservation biological control. They call it habitat management for beneficial insects. There are university departments dedicated to it. There are government programs that pay farmers to implement it. There are conferences and journals and experts who've built entire careers on the foundation that Walter Briggs laid with a $12.50 bag of wildflower seeds. Walter Briggs died in 1994 at the age of 67, a tractor accident, the same way too many farmers go, doing the work they love until the very end. His son, Michael, took over the farm and kept planting the flower strips, just like his father taught him. There's no statue of Walter Briggs in St. John, Kansas, no memorial plaque at the feed store where they laughed at him, no building named in his honor at Kansas State. But if you drive through Stafford County today, you'll see his legacy everywhere. The flower strips along the fence lines, the wildflower meadows at the edges of the fields, the splashes of color in the middle of the wheat, black-eyed Susans and cone flowers and wild bergamot, just like Walter planted 50 years ago. And if you stop your car and walk into one of those fields on a summer morning, you'll see the ladybugs, millions of them, red shells and black spots, crawling over the wheat stalks, eating aphids one by one, doing the job they've been doing for millions of years, ever since long before humans started farming. That's the story of Walter Briggs and his bug garden. The story of a man who read some books and paid attention and had an idea that everyone thought was crazy. Here's what I want you to think about tonight. In 1973, the experts said spray. The extension agents said spray. The chemical companies said spray. Every farmer in Stafford County said spray. And they laughed at the one man who said maybe there's another way. Walter wasn't smarter than them. He wasn't braver. He wasn't trying to prove a point or make a statement. He'd just noticed something they hadn't noticed, read something they hadn't read, and been willing to look foolish for a few years while he tested his idea. The pesticide treadmill is still running today. Farmers are still spraying more and more chemicals to fight bugs that keep getting more and more resistant. The same trap Walter saw in 1973 is still catching people 50 years later. But there are also more flower strips than ever before, more farmers planting habitat for beneficial insects, more people who understand that the solution to a pest problem isn't always a bigger chemical. Sometimes it's a smaller bug with a bigger appetite. Walter Briggs didn't save the world, he just saved his farm, and then he shared what he'd learned with his neighbors. That's how change happens, one farm at a time, one flower strip at a time. One person willing to look foolish for a few years while everyone else laughs. They called him the bug farmer. It turns out he was the only one who understood what the bugs were really for.